Welcome to Module 4 of our virtual executive trade course. I hope you had a good weekend, and we welcome you to this module, and we'll be with you unfortunately only today in terms of live sessions, but you will of course have an opportunity to spend the week to perhaps review this material and to look at the recommended leading list to enhance even your understanding of the issues that will be presented today. So today we will have two sessions back to back. They're both live, and we will have this session from 9:30 to 12:30 Geneva time, but we will take the break in the middle, about 15 minutes break. So first we will start with a session on UN Food Systems Summit and its links and impact on trade. We allotted 1 hour and 45 minutes, including the questions for this session. Then we will take 15 minutes break, and we are live again at 11:30 until 12:30 for the session on the G20 Agriculture Market Information System. So let me introduce our first speaker, our colleague from the Agriculture and Commodities Division, Ms. Doa Abdelmota, and she will be with you for an hour and a half. I understand that you can ask questions, and you also would put your questions into the chat. So I now invite Doha to go on with this session until 11:15. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thank you, Alicia, and hello, everyone. I think it is amazing that we're able to do this in this way, that we're able to conduct technical assistance across time zones in this way. It's an incredible opportunity that we must indeed seize. So speaking of technology, let me see if I am able to seize that technology by successfully sharing my screen. I'm not always very good at these things, and you will let me know if, Alicia, does that look good? It looks good. Okay, I am just going to adjust how I view all of you so I can, and I also want to see the chat. Having trouble seeing the chat. Okay. So I can see all of you, but I can't see the chat. So let me just see if there's another way to do this. No. I can't see the chat, and let me just see how I can view all participants.
Would you like to perhaps make the view screen a little bit smaller so you could perhaps see the chat on the right side?
Yeah, let me see how to do that.
In the right-hand corner at the top, there is this little button called View, and there is Exit Full Screen. View.
Exit full screen. So wait, let me stop sharing for a second and then reshare in a different way. Okay, just a second. So I will now share my screen, and I'll put this. But let's see if I can see the chat. I still can't see the chat. That's strange. Okay, but we can do this differently, Alicia. So I think what we can do is the following. When you have questions, I would just suggest that you intervene straight away. So I'd like to do two things. As I present, if you have questions that you think are relevant to the slide, please just feel free to step in, because I can't see all of you and see my slides at the same time because of limited screen space. And then once we come to the Q&A, I would suggest we do the same at the end of the presentation. So feel free to decide as I move through this presentation when you want to put your questions. And I hope that this session can be as interactive as possible, because the topics are, this is a topic that is designed to be very interactive. I want us to reflect on what the significance is of the UN Food Systems Summit and its links to what we do in the WTO. You're okay, Alicia, with how they're seeing my screen? Are they seeing the full presentation? Okay, good. All right, so I'd like to start by saying a word about why we decided to include this topic, because it may seem a little strange to you. You know, why is it relevant to discuss the UN Food Systems Summit and its relationship to what the WTO does? I would say it is extremely relevant because for those of you who might have been following the work of the WTO in agriculture, you may know that we have made very limited progress since the agreement on agriculture of the Uruguay round came into place. We've made very limited progress in liberalizing agricultural trade. So the question is, why have we made such limited progress? I would say that the main area in which progress has been made has been on the complete elimination of export subsidies for food. That is really, I think, the most significant decision taken by the WTO from the Uruguay round to today. We eliminated food export subsidies. But the reason we succeeded in eliminating them was because they had disappeared almost by themselves. Countries had stopped subsidizing the export of food. So in a way, it was something that was going to happen in any case, and we consolidated it. But on all other areas of agriculture, the organization is struggling. And what I want us to do in this presentation is to reflect on the reasons for that struggle. And part of the reasons are the broader context of food systems. You know, what does food represent to countries? What does the agricultural sector represent to countries in terms of employment, in terms of addressing social issues, in terms of rural development, in terms of food security? There are so many issues surrounding food within which our agreement on agriculture operates, that we need to understand that broader world around the WTO to see why we're not making progress and why we're blocked within the organization. So that's really the purpose of this presentation. Now, the UN Food Systems Summit, what was it? Well, it was a call by the UN Secretary General in 2021 for a summit to be held that would excuse me for a second, that would address food in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Secretary General realized that we have a problem with our food systems. Trade is only part of the issue with food systems. Other problems include, of course, and what he was thinking about when he announced this before the COVID crisis. He announced it for 2021 before knowing that the COVID crisis would hit. And what he was mainly thinking about at the time was sustainability, climate change, sustainability, and so on. And he chose as the special envoy for the summit, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who became the special envoy. She was the former Minister of Agriculture of Rwanda from 2008 to 2014, and the president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Why is that relevant? Because the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa is an organization that seeks to integrate the private sector into African agriculture, and there are a lot of companies that work with Agra. And when he nominated her, there was an outcry by NGOs, by a lot of communities in the food system who said, is she the right person? Do we want a corporate view of agriculture to dominate the UN Food Systems Summit? He insisted on his position and she became the envoy. But, I mention this because I think it's relevant for you to know that there are all these tensions within food systems between the role of corporations, the role of government, the role of international organizations. Food systems are very complicated. There are a lot of different interests and a lot of different players. And the Food Systems Summit certainly gave us a view of this. Now, what is interesting is that he called it the Food Systems, plural, Summit, and this became the logo of the summit. And I think that S is very relevant for us in the WTO. We have 164 member countries who take very different approaches to food policy. Some who are more market-oriented, others who are less market-oriented, those who believe in a certain amount of food sovereignty, and you will hear that term throughout this presentation, where you need to have a certain amount of strategic autonomy in your food in the event of crises. So you want to depend on international trade for some of your food, but you want to make sure that at a time of crisis, you're able to survive alone if you get cut off from the rest of the world, food sovereignty. So there are a variety of different food systems across the world for many different reasons, and it became important to reflect that in the very title of the summit. And I think that title is very reflective of why we're struggling in the WTO, because we are trying to create trade rules that can work across all of these different food systems of our 164 member countries. So that became very significant that from the outset, that S was put there. Now, the Food Systems Summit created 5 action tracks. So the summit was divided into sort of 5 areas of work. Action track 1, ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all. And by access, it was about poverty alleviation, creating markets infrastructure for the food to get to people. So it had an economic angle, but it also an infrastructure angle. Shift to sustainable consumption patterns. And there the focus has been on greener diets, a change of diets so that we would rely less on livestock, which contributes to climate change and carbon emissions, and more on production, on vegetarian diets, essentially. A very controversial issue within the summit because of the livestock industry. Because of international organizations also, there are international organizations that work exclusively on livestock, like the International Organization for Epizootics, etc., that have been pushing a very strong meat agenda. So there was that friction within the summit between, those who argue that livestock is sustainable and those who argue that it's not. Boosting nature positive production, and again, this was about sustainable production and not just sustainable consumption. So from the start, taking planting decisions and agricultural decisions that would focus on enhancing our environment and choosing those foods that are compatible with the future and with a green climate agenda. Equitable livelihoods, looking at farmers. What are the interests of farmers within food systems and how can they be reconciled? In Action Track 5, building resilience to vulnerability, shocks, and stress was added, of course, given that after the UN Secretary General proposed, the idea of a food systems summit, COVID-19 struck. And resilience and to shocks and vulnerabilities became a key issue because COVID was very disruptive, and we can discuss that. We should discuss that, I hope, during the Q&A at the end, the impact of COVID-19 on food markets. And as I said, feel free to step in with your questions if you have them. During the presentation. So if you have burning questions as I speak, feel free to just turn on your mic, step in, introduce yourself, and ask your question. So the issue of food shocks and vulnerabilities became a really big theme in the Food Systems Summit, and it became a really big theme in the WTO, as you can imagine. because as COVID-19 struck, countries were very worried about their food security, and we saw a wave of food export restrictions, and we'll be talking about the problem of food export restrictions as we go through this presentation, where countries, the first sort of gut response to the crisis was, oh, well, I had better stop exporting my rice or my wheat in case something happens to international markets, in case supply chains get disrupted. I had better keep my food staples in particular for myself. So those were the 5 action tracks established by the UNSG for the Food Systems Summit. And what the purpose of this presentation is to see how all of that has interacted with what we do in WTO and how it should make us think and rethink our agenda in the WTO. Now, interestingly enough, trade was considered a taboo subject in the summit. We are used to this in the WTO. In what sense? For example, in the FAO, the world has established a committee called the World Committee on Food Security, the CFS, which some of you may have heard about. That World Committee on Food Security is not allowed to discuss trade. There's an unspoken agreement that trade has to be left to the WTO. And it has mainly been, the very strong trading nations who have not wanted international trade to get discussed in the United Nations, international food trade to get discussed in the United Nations. And so, we already have an experience with that in the Committee on World Food Security. And once the summit got announced, the same exact issue happened. The US and a lot of others said, look, the summit had better not touch trade. Trade is within the purview and the mandate of the WTO. However, what we have in the WTO is the opposite problem. We have trouble in the WTO discussing food security. As soon as we try to liberalize trade, a lot of countries coalesce and say, wait a second, trade rules should not go here because that's a food security issue. We need a food security carve out from WTO rules, if you will. And so we kind of have the opposite wall in the WTO where countries use food security to stop the advance of trade liberalization. And in the UN, we have the opposite situation where countries don't want trade to remain outside of the food security conversation. And I mention this to you because it is a problem with how the international system is set up. We are unable to find a forum where we're able to discuss all of these issues in a non-politicized way. And obviously there is a huge link between trade and food security, which somebody's going to have to discuss sooner or later. So trade is a taboo subject. So did trade not get addressed at all in the Food Systems Summit? It did get addressed because we, the Secretariat, the WTO Secretariat, worked very hard with the UN Secretary General to make sure that somehow trade would get mentioned, at least in his closing statement of the summit. So indeed, we succeeded, we, the WTO Secretariat, in getting a sentence into his closing statement on international trade, saying the following: open, non-discriminatory, and transparent rules-based trade is essential for building more inclusive and resilient food systems. So, it was important to get the UN Secretary General to say that open trade is good for food systems. Despite challenges to global supply chains, COVID-19 has shown the resilience of local and regional food systems, and this is true. And in fact, all our trade statistics have demonstrated that during the COVID-19 pandemic, whereas, overall international trade shrunk significantly, agricultural trade resisted. And it resisted because food consumption cannot be postponed. So as airports were shutting down, as seaports were shutting down, as quarantine requirements were being imposed, countries were making every effort, however, to make sure that food was still moving across the planet because it was a food security issue and people still needed to eat. And so food trade proved to be very inelastic, which is a very good outcome for the agricultural sector. And many countries quickly designated agriculture as an essential economic sector, i.e. some of the quarantine requirements, some of the logistical hurdles, etc., could be overcome to allow food to move. So that second statement of the UN Secretary General is absolutely right, that the agricultural sector proved more resilient. But it was very important for us to get that statement because we wanted to make sure that even though the summit had not discussed trade, the trade was recognized, because essentially what trade does is it moves food from countries that are in shortage, from countries that have a surplus to countries that are in shortage. And we absolutely, needed to recognize that and wanted the world to recognize that within the context of the Food Systems Summit. Now, in the Food Systems Summit, a whole range of issues were discussed that are vital for discussions in the WTO. Food security, obviously, countries wanted to put the issue of food security squarely on the agenda. How do we ensure food security within the variety of food systems that exist across the globe? How do we address environmental concerns, and in particular the climate challenge and the issue of livestock, which is central to the climate challenge, because that is the most livestock emit methane, as and contribute. The livestock sector in particular contributes very seriously to climate change. Of course, there are other problems in agriculture like fertilizer and other things that contribute to climate change, but the livestock sector in particular is the one targeted by environmental groups to green agriculture. Farmers' rights. Here we go into a lot of intellectual property rights. In the Food Systems Summit, they wanted to address farmers' rights from a human rights perspective. What are the rights of farmers? And of course, I don't know if you know this, but one of the tragedies today is that we still have a lot of hungry and undernourished people across the globe. And surprisingly, many of them are farmers. So that's one of the most sort of shocking statistics that one comes across in the agriculture field, that a lot of the hungry people in the world are actually farmers, but a lot of farmers prefer to sell and to export their food than to actually nourish themselves because of poverty, so extreme poverty in rural areas. The summit addressed nutrition, a very complicated and also very political subject in the end, because what is good nutrition? There are a lot of economic interests at play behind what is good or what is bad nutrition. With, for example, the livestock sector wanting proteins and meat-based proteins to be recognized in the list of nutritious foods. There's the dairy sector that also feels somewhat attacked by what they call misinformation about dairy products. So there's a lot of, there were a lot of negotiations at the summit as to what is good and what is bad nutrition. Technology, another very controversial issue, because there are technologies that some countries use in the agricultural sector that others don't accept, like biotechnology. You will have heard of genetically modified foods. So technology was a very big issue at the summit. We have seen technology issues become a problem in the WTO, agricultural technology, with the US bringing an important case against the EU on food biotechnology in the WTO, and it's still an ongoing problem. The US uses genetic modification. The EU says it doesn't, some EU member countries don't accept it as much as others. There are negotiations within the EU on the issue. So not just the EU versus other WTO members, but within the EU, there are negotiations on biotechnology, with some countries being more open to it than others. Food waste was a big issue, of course, in the summit. A lot of food is wasted. There's food is wasted at different, there's food loss and food waste. And in fact, I should probably put both terms in that box, food loss and food waste. A lot of food is lost after production because there's no storage, in particular in some developed and least developed countries. So, and there are statistics on the amount of food loss, but there's a lot of food lost from the field going forward. Because of poor storage. And then there's food waste, the waste that hotels generate, restaurants generate, and the food that each one of us generates with the food that we leave on our plates. Again, it does have a WTO component because some food gets wasted at countries' borders because of slow customs clearance procedures. And in particular, I chose here in this photo a picture of fruits and vegetables because in particular, it is the food perishables that go to waste. So staple foods like the grains, etc., are easier to protect at that final stage when they cross borders than our perishables, which really need to move across borders with speed. We have a trade facilitation agreement in the WTO that is designed to expedite procedures at borders, and it specifically speaks about food perishables. And I think that countries want, at the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, which will be our next ministerial conference, to take the trade facilitation agreement more into the direction of food perishables, looking at what specific issues perishable foods face at the border and how we can expedite their movement. So, food waste was a big issue at the summit, and it has a component in the WTO. Value chains also became a big issue at the summit and are, of course, a huge issue in the WTO. And I think here the issue is that, as you know, when we often say this in WTO, when we write on a product made in and we put a country, in fact, that's no longer an accurate reflection of reality, because foods and as do all other products, all products are manufactured across many different countries. And made in is becoming less and less realistic and a less and less accurate description of what is happening to internationally traded products. Now, with respect to food, the FAO tells us that on average, agricultural commodities, about a third of agricultural commodities cross 2 to 3 borders before they are turned into food. So that, they're referring there to food processing. There is a value chain of production. So the primary material will travel from country A to country B. Country B will do some processing, move the food to country C, where maybe the packaging and something else will happen. And so a lot of foods now move across borders and across many different borders, a lot of commodities before they're turned into food. And so value chains are very important from a WTO perspective because they reflect how trade actually happens. But they are also, they were also an important topic at the Food Systems Summit because countries wanted to make sure that those value chains were working for them, that they are fair, that they are equitable, and that they reflect all of these other elements that you have here, that, no food waste happens across the value chains, that farmers' rights remain protected in those chains, that those chains don't contribute to environmental damage, that food doesn't lose its nutritional value as it travels, and that the value chains are kept open for food security. So a lot of different issues were discussed at the summit, which for us in the WTO, we tend to refer to as agricultural trade and subjects. We focus on trade, but in reality, agricultural trade has all of these dimensions. Now, I'd like to sort of step back a bit to go into the WTO rulebook. So we see how we can anchor and, what are the linkages between all of those UN Food Systems Summit issues and our rulebook, because in the end, the purpose of this presentation is to sort of see the intersection between all of these different things. So The birth of an agreement on agriculture, an agreement specific to agriculture, was something that happened in the Uruguay round. And agriculture, and it happened late relative to industrial products, because agriculture has always been an extremely sensitive sector. We laugh in the WTO amongst colleagues that, as we have disputes to do with Boeing and Airbus and just very sophisticated, industrial policy disputes, we will always have a salmon dispute, a banana case. Food just doesn't go away. As sophisticated as the world becomes with industrial products, disputes to do with the wheat, with bananas, with salmon will always be found in the list of disputes that are happening in the WTO. So agriculture remains an extremely sensitive sector because in the developing world, it employs huge numbers of people. In some African countries, up to 80% of employment is in agriculture. Agriculture is also linked to the environment. So for the EU, for example, that has always been an important issue. What happens to the agricultural sector has serious environmental implications. And so that link to the environment has also made it sensitive. And of course, food security, people, countries worry about their food security. They do want to achieve some of that food security through international trade, but there's a certain amount of food self-sufficiency that they want. So that has also made agriculture sensitive. And then there are all the cultural issues associated with food. So I'm Egyptian, for example, and my country has a particular view on alcohol, on meats. It wants halal meat, and so on. So there are a lot of cultural issues also associated with food. The EU, for example, has been resistant to genetically modified foods. So there are consumer preferences and cultural issues that come into play. All of this has made agriculture sensitive. Now, before the Uruguay round, if we had liberalized trade in industrial products up to here, agricultural products, there was a lot of work that still needed to be done in agricultural products. There were few market opening commitments, few tariff bindings, a lot of quantitative restrictions, many different types of subsidies. So the situation was very chaotic before the agreement on agriculture came into being. Now, I would say that in the Uruguay round, we made achievements on agriculture along what we broke down into three different pillars: market access, domestic support, which in WTO language refers to internal subsidies. They're called domestic support in WTO language, and export competition. So all the different ways in which countries push their exports onto the international market. A lot of countries try to encourage exports in ways that are sometimes harmful to their trading partners who want a more level playing field as they compete. So we created, we created three different pillars, if you wish, for the types of trade distortions that existed in agriculture, and tried to make progress in each of those pillars. So in market access, we created the WTO Agreement on Agriculture created a tariff-only regime in the sense that a lot of quantitative restrictions were converted into their tariff equivalents. A lot of QRs, variable levies, import bans, all sorts of other measures were brought under control. Tariffs were reduced by developed countries by 36%, developing by 24%, but some amount of protection, some space was given to countries to continue to protect themselves in the agricultural sector. If imports were to rise significantly, if prices were to fall dramatically, there would be a special safeguard mechanism that some could use based on the products they had identified at the time to protect themselves. So some measure of protection was built into the agreement. This is on the market access front. So significant progress happened on the market access front in terms of cleaning up, if you will, the kinds of measures that countries took to obstruct trade. Then we created an approach to dealing with internal subsidies. And it was very hard, of course, as you can imagine, to come up with an architecture that made sense. This made sense at the time of the Uruguay round. We have to see if it continues to make sense as the architecture today, frankly. But we basically, oh, sorry, I think I moved too fast. We basically created an amber box, a blue box, and a green box categorization of subsidies. In the amber box, we put the worst kinds of subsidies, which are the trade distorting subsidies. So when a country says, I will pay a farmer to grow X amount, X tons of corn, that's sort of the worst kind of subsidy. You're actually completely distorting markets by telling a farmer what to produce and how much to produce, and you're paying him or her to do so. And those amber box subsidies, those worst kinds of subsidies, the WTO tried to reduce. Developed countries had to cut them by 20%, developing countries by 13%. But during the Uruguay round, there was a recognition that reform wouldn't happen overnight. There were a lot of subsidies out there that were very harmful, and countries would need to take a progressive approach. And so a blue box of subsidies was created where you could actually subsidize a farmer to reduce production of something so that you could take that farmer in the direction of reform. So that's a permissible box of subsidies where you can subsidize to achieve reform. And in fact, that blue box is now coming under fire because, the WTO was established in 1996. The WTO Agreement on Agriculture came into force in 96. And, we're now in 2022. So do we still, has that reform still not been completed? Is this box still necessary? What is the kind of stuff that countries are really, calling blue at the moment? And then we created a green box of permissible support. This is support that is okay. It's green lighted. Countries can go ahead and give those kinds of subsidies, which are subsidies for rural development, which are subsidies to help poor farmers, access inputs, all sorts of environmental protection, research and development can go into the green box. Now, again, that was the architecture of the Uruguay round. Today, and at the UN Food Systems Summit, a lot of players questioned whether the WTO green box is green. With a lot of countries saying, and a lot of actors saying, frankly, what was considered green box support back then is very harmful for the environment today. A lot of what countries are subsidizing hurts the environment, and that green box needs to be revisited. So I think that, those are things that the WTO might need to address going forward, but that was the architecture that was created at the time for subsidies. And, if you put yourself in the position of negotiators at the time and you try to think, oh, well, could they have done this differently? Was there a different way of breaking down that support? I'm sure, that they could have sliced the problem in different ways, possibly. But, they did their best, and they went from good, bad to ugly, if you will. The worst subsidies were put into that amber box that had to be reduced from a trade perspective, the worst subsidies from a trade distorting perspective. And then they tried to relax the rules going forward so that it wouldn't be too harsh a beginning. But obviously today there's a need to really seriously re-examine that classification and see, and given the fact that we've not been able to cut subsidies since the Uruguay round, we have to see why we're not able to do that. On export competition, subsidies that are contingent on export performance were prohibited. Or reduced, government export sales or stock disposals, provisions were taken on that, subsidies affecting marketing and transportation, all of these subsidies that promote exports, countries tried to rein in. And as I said, one of the big achievements, probably the only major achievement since the Uruguay round in the area of agriculture, was the fact that we completely banned export subsidies in the WTO. So countries tried to address as well the export competition front. Now, this is just to give you sort of the basic architecture of the WTO agreement on agriculture. Now, that agreement came into place, but the world changed around the WTO. So that agreement happened, but as you see, we live in a very fast moving world where we've had the COVID crisis that nobody could imagine. We now have war. And so it's been very hard for the agreement, for further trade liberalization to take place. So the world changed around the WTO, but the world changed inside WTO as well, because developing countries became stronger. The BRICS, there was the emergence of the BRICS group of countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Developing countries found their voice, started to create coalitions within the WTO. So, the membership of the organization expanded, new countries acceded, such as with the accession of China. And so the actors within the WTO became much more numerous. The voices that could actually be heard around the WTO became much more significant, but also the world changed around the organization with environmental concerns, food security concerns, a different geopolitical order, alliances, the rise of free trade agreements. So all of that had a serious impact on our ability to make progress. Stumbling blocks in the WTO agriculture negotiations, and this is where we move into the intersection with the issues raised at the Food Systems Summit. So the WTO agriculture negotiations tried to, as I said, the current negotiations. So the agreement on agriculture tried to move on several fronts, but we still have a committee on agriculture in special session in the WTO today that is trying to negotiate further trade opening in agriculture. It's still trying to reduce agricultural subsidies. It's still trying to reduce agricultural tariffs. It's still trying to improve export competition, but it's also trying to address export restrictions, which are becoming a very big issue in international food trade. Export restrictions basically have to do with the problem of countries restricting the export, probably and most often of staple foods like rice, wheat, and so on, whenever there's a global crisis. We saw this in the 2008 food price crisis. In 2008, countries believed that the world might be moving into a food crisis for a variety of different reasons, including the rise of biofuels. Many countries started to use food to produce fuel, and there was concern that there would be a global food shortage because of that. A lot of corn, a lot of sugar was being used to produce biofuels. And so in 2008, in the fear that there would be a global food shortage, some countries started to restrict export in rice, others export in wheat, and so on. And one export restriction created panic and led to another. And in the end, in 2008, global food prices rose by about 30%, with even higher rises for particular types of food like rice and so on that had been the specific target of export restrictions. And since then, the WTO has been trying to address the issue of food export restrictions. How do we ensure that countries are controlled in the event of a crisis, and that the food system can continue to be reliable, that food can continue to move across the globe without those kinds of barriers? So this is the agenda that's now being sort of discussed in ongoing agriculture negotiations. And again, please feel free to just step in with your questions or comments as we go through this presentation. Now, the negotiations are facing a number of different stumbling blocks. Unsurprisingly, Those stumbling blocks are the exact set of issues that were discussed in the UN Food Systems Summit. Food security, social concerns, environmental concerns, technology, humanitarian issues, and so on. Let's go through them. Food security. So in the ongoing agriculture negotiations in the WTO, a number of countries are saying, look, we should have the right to create public stocks, food public stocks in our countries, because it is absolutely necessary at times of crisis that we have stocks of wheat, stocks of grain, stocks of rice, and so on. In fact, some countries have also meat stocks. As hard as it is to conserve those stocks, some countries have stocks of meat as well. But in the WTO, food public stock holding is a problem when that food gets dumped onto the international market. What often happens is that when countries stock up on food, they don't get the exact amount of food stock right. And once they see that some of the stock may go to waste, they quickly try to sell it onto international markets. And that has created problems for international trade in the past, where suddenly, large quantities of rice from a country's food stock would be dumped on an international market, causing the international price of that food to collapse and putting, other countries in a lot of trouble, other countries that sell that same food in a lot of trouble. And so public food stocks have been very controversial in the WTO because of that export dimension to them. But India and many G33 countries are saying in the WTO agriculture negotiation, our food public stock holding cannot be considered amber box. If you consider our food public stock holding to be amber box, and if you ask us to make reductions of that food public stock holding, then we cannot agree to a final deal, because those food stocks are absolutely essential for our food security. So food public stock holding has become a big problem in the WTO. Social concerns and rural development, and I will come back to that with more detail in the rest of the presentation. But again, here the developing world says, I need to be able to subsidize the inputs that my farmers get. I need to be able to subsidize rural areas and for rural transformation. I need to be able to address those concerns without the rest of the world telling me that these are amber box subsidies, trade distorting subsidies that I need to reduce. And again, this goes to the sort of social concerns that were discussed at the Food Systems Summit. The issue of carbon taxes were a big issue at the UN Food Systems Summit. They're a big issue at the UN climate negotiations, and they are a big issue at WTO. So basically, we have countries that want to start introducing carbon taxes, including on imports, to penalize other trading nations that are not protecting the environment. And their argument is that the globe is interconnected. It's one place. If you're not doing anything to fight climate change, global warming will hit me as much as you because of your actions. And therefore, I have the right to impose a carbon tax on whatever I import that has led to carbon emissions and that has led to global warming. A very slippery slope in the WTO. We're beginning to discuss it in the WTO formally and probably more informally. And it's a very controversial issue because the EU has a border tax adjustment proposal that is being discussed internally. And many developing countries are saying, the EU can't self-appoint itself as sort of the global environmental regulator by imposing a carbon tax onto what comes into the EU. That would mean that the EU is deciding for other nations how they should fight climate change. There's an international forum for that, which are the UN the UN climate negotiations. Countries should address that within the framework of the UN FCCC. The WTO is not the right place and trade is not the right instrument. And so we're kind of locked into that negotiation. Then comes the issue of biotechnology and nutrition. So now those are not playing out directly into the Committee on Agriculture. So biotechnology has been a problem in the WTO, but it's not under discussion within the Committee on Agriculture and Special Session, the negotiating group, but it is a background issue and a background concern that countries are applying different technologies to their agriculture and they want different kinds of regulations. So biotechnology and nutrition are both sort of regulatory issues. Those regulatory issues tend to get discussed under two agreements in the WTO, the Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures and the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, which are agreements that basically say countries are allowed to regulate, but here are the rules. You must be basing yourself on science, you must be applying risk assessment and so on. But, obviously the issue of biotechnology is creating a huge amount of friction and has been a very serious test to the WTO Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures. So sometimes the disputes that come to the WTO are so big in their dimension that they really stretch our agreements and can threaten the architecture of WTO. If the dispute is so big and the economic interests are so large, we try to apply our agreements to them, but they stretch, obviously, our agreements, and they stretch the WTO. And so there's a balance between, preserving the WTO system and finding solutions to trade problems. And I think biotechnology is really stretching the agreement. Nutrition is a big concern. It's addressed under both the Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures and the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade. For example, there's a new nutrition label now that is called Nutri-Score that was discussed in the UN Food Systems Summit that is creating a lot of tension in the WTO. And this is a nutrition label that is a color label. It's designed to simplify completely consumer choice. So as you pick up a product in a supermarket, and a lot of countries already use it, Belgium and so on, where if the color is red, it means it's very bad for nutrition. If the color is yellow, it's a little less bad. If it's green, it's a very nutritious product. In the WTO, that kind of simplification is creating a lot of tension between countries, with many countries saying, I don't agree, with that very simple kind of labeling, and that's misleading. You're misleading consumers. And you are moving them away from my products, basically, without just cause, and that the scientific reasoning is not sufficient for Nutri-Score. So a lot of debates in the WTO about nutrition. Again, nutrition, as you see, in our negotiations, we're discussing subsidies, tariffs, competition, export restrictions. We're not discussing those regulatory issues, but they are part of the background in these two other agreements that deal with regulations that are also leading to a stalemate in this negotiation. So I think it's important to see all of this as a whole, because things are not divisible. Agricultural policy is one. And when a country looks at its interests, it doesn't look at those four issues alone. It's looking at its agricultural sector holistically. Then there's the issue of humanitarian food aid. That is blocking these negotiations, but which was also a big topic in the UN Food Systems Summit. What is that about? Well, it goes to the issue of export restrictions. Now, when there's a crisis like the war in Ukraine that is happening at the moment, countries start to impose food export restrictions in the fear of a global shortage, in the fear that global value chains will not function properly as they should. But the problem is that when they impose those food export restrictions, the World Food Programme becomes unable to purchase the food it needs to give humanitarian aid. And so in the WTO, under this pillar of export restrictions, countries have said, we need to create an exemption for the World Food Programme. So, we already have in the WTO Agreement on Agriculture Article 12 of the agreement, so, if you do have your WTO rule book, Article 12 of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture already creates a framework for how to address export restrictions. Members have to give consideration to the food security implications of their trading partners before imposing those restrictions. They have to give some advance notice, and they must agree to consultations if a trading nation, is in trouble. For example, in the 2008 food price crisis that I cited, when a lot of Asian countries banned the export of rice, we in the WTO had immediate visits from the ministers of agriculture of, in particular, Gulf Arab countries like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, etc., who cannot survive without food imports. Now, the problem gets worse when it's the World Food Program that can't buy what it needs, and therefore it can't even give humanitarian assistance. And so the issue of humanitarian assistance has been put on the WTO agenda, and the Committee on Agriculture in special session is trying to obtain a complete exemption for the World Food Program from these restrictions. And that issue was a big issue at the UN Food Systems Summit, where the World Food Program was a very active player, of course, and wanted to see that issue resolved. Now, how do we in the WTO address, what is the sort of standard response to these stumbling blocks as they are raised in the WTO? The traditional response of the WTO is to say WTO agreements create policy space. And what does policy space mean? It means that countries have space under WTO rules to address the trade and concerns, the agriculture and concerns, which are the issues raised in the UN Food Systems Summit. There's a green box where countries can apply environmental subsidies. That's already allowed in the WTO. There's a blue box to help you achieve agricultural reform. You can subsidize to help farmers adapt and transition to the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a development box. Now, I didn't put it in the three big boxes that you saw earlier, amber box, blue box, green box, because it's a smaller provision in the agreement. It's Article 6.2 of the agreement, which allows developing countries to use particular kinds of subsidies. So if you look at, if you look at your agreement, it says the developing countries may use agricultural subsidies to support low income and resource poor producers, and that those subsidies will be exempt from the amber box. You can also put in that development box subsidies that are designed to help your farmers move away from growing narcotics and illicit trade and so on. So, so the WTO's traditional response is, look, there's, countries have space within these boxes to use subsidies in ways that help them achieve other goals. There are also exceptions under GATT Article 20, which can override the agreement on agriculture, where a country may depart from basic WTO principles to achieve conservation, or to ban products that are the outcome of prison labor. So those are just examples. Article 20 exceptions are very long. But this is just to tell you the sort of traditional WTO response is there is space within WTO agreements for countries to address the trade and issues. Now, I want to sort of zoom in on a few of the very specific concerns. So I set out for you here those stumbling blocks, and I would just like to zoom in on a few of them to give you a bit, a bit of a more detailed flavor. So, under food security, a big topic at the UN Food Systems Summit, I would say that we have 4 issues specifically that intersect with that concern. First is the issue of food public stocks that I spoke to you about, you know, countries wanting to store bags of grain. There are food public stocks that exist at the national level. So China has a lot of those. For example, China has meat stocks as well, pig meat, which turned out to be very helpful when there was swine flu. China was able to draw a lot of meat during the swine flu crisis from its pork public stocks. So we spoke about that issue, and we spoke about how that issue is problematic when those stocks get exported. Countries panic when that food is about to go bad, and they sell it on the international market. That's one way in which we intersect with food security. The other is humanitarian assistance. We just spoke about that, the World Food Programme, its ability to make purchases during a time of crisis. There is also the more complex issue of support for farmers, in particular in developing countries. This is a really big problem in WTO. In the current negotiation, this is a huge problem. So what we are trying to do in the negotiation is to reduce amber box subsidies in particular. The focus is on the amber box, the worst kinds of subsidies. Now, since the Agreement on Agriculture came into being, we have cut developed world subsidies and we cut some developing country subsidies. But in reality, during the period since the Agreement on Agriculture came into being and until today, whereas developed country subsidies have been going down, developing country subsidies have been on the rise. And so there's now this enormous call on developing countries to reduce their agricultural subsidies. Developing countries are responding. They're saying that would be inequitable. The developed world has lived with subsidies for a really long time. We need those subsidies to develop our agriculture. You can't take away from us this vital tool for the development of our agricultural sector. So we have a situation, and it's not dissimilar to what is happening in the global climate negotiations, where developed countries are asking developing countries to reduce carbon emissions, but developing countries are saying, historically, you guys are the reason why we have a climate crisis. Yes, our emissions are rising too today, but that climate crisis is your fault. And this is very similar to what is happening on subsidies here in the WTO. Developing countries are saying, you guys have enjoyed agricultural subsidies for decades, until the Agreement on Agriculture came into place. We hardly had any subsidies at the time. Now our subsidies are rising. You want us to cut them. You have to give us development space. And so this is a very serious sort of stumbling block now in the negotiations with developed countries wanting to rein in Article 6.2 in particular, which gives developing countries the right to use particular kinds of subsidies for development purposes to help, resource poor farmers and so on. So that's another sort of expression of the food security problem and how it intersects with our rule book. And then we have the issue of export restrictions, which is, for me personally, I think that that's a catastrophic issue. It's a catastrophic issue because every time there is a global crisis, if food export restrictions start to emerge, then countries feel that the WTO rulebook has no value. If every time there's a crisis, there's no more, countries that depend on international trade for food security get cut off, then the legitimate reaction becomes, well, international trade is not reliable in food. I need more public stocks. I need more self-sufficiency and less international trade. If those export restrictions are not controlled, if there's no mechanism to make them illegal, then basically it would be dangerous for me as a country to continue to depend on international markets. I would be putting my people at risk. So this single issue goes to the sort of credibility of the international trading system in food. and is a very serious problem. We saw it at the beginning of the COVID crisis. We saw it in 2008, as I said. We saw it in the beginning of the COVID crisis, but luckily a lot of heads of international organizations intervened, the WTO, the FAO, even the World Health Organization spoke out against food export restrictions. We saw at the beginning of COVID many different restrictions, but gradually they were rolled back. We're now seeing them come back with the Ukraine crisis. What is interesting is that we made modest progress in January 2021 after the COVID crisis, with 80 countries saying the following, signing a joint statement, so 80 out of 164, signing a joint statement saying we recognize the critical humanitarian support provided by the World Food Programme, made more urgent in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and other crises. We therefore commit to not impose export prohibitions or restrictions on foodstuffs purchased for non-commercial humanitarian purposes by the World Food Programme. So 80 countries of the WTO have committed to not impose sudden food export restrictions and prohibitions on World Food Programme purchases, but they are only 80. Now, of course, you would have to study this list to see who is missing, but you will find that a lot of the rice exporters are not there. You will find some of the grain exporters not there. So, you know, a lot of countries are still not convinced that they are able to make this commitment, and they feel that prioritizing their food security over the humanitarian relief given by the World Food Programme is more important. Rightly so, and of course nobody's asking a country to sort of starve its population so that the World Food Programme can go help someone else. But I think the goal is that, the goal is to not have those restrictions be arbitrary and to really take into account, when you take this decision, the mandate of the World Food Programme and the issue of humanitarian assistance. Now, what I put here at the bottom of the slide is the fact that just this week we saw Hungary impose export restrictions, I believe on wheat, if I'm not mistaken. We saw in the press today that Moldova has done the same, and the question is whether more of this is likely to follow. So we're seeing a new wave now. And this happens every time there's a global crisis of any kind. Countries start to hoard the food. Next, environment, climate change. So I spoke a bit about that. We're sort of going through this list of stumbling blocks, and I'm just, giving you, what I'm doing now is sort of zooming in on a few of those to give you a slightly more detailed flavor of the concerns. So we've discussed food security. Now, environment and climate change. I spoke about the carbon tax. Now, the carbon tax, if applied to agriculture, of course, would be hugely problematic. If every time somebody sells meat to the EU, that meat gets slapped with a carbon tax based on how much, the livestock sector of the exporting country emitted, obviously we will have a very complicated, WTO on our hands and a lot of trade frictions. But of course, the carbon tax is being discussed across many different sectors. Agriculture is one potential sector down the line. It's not at the forefront at the moment, but it's still on the minds of EU countries. The green box, so that was a big issue at the UN Food Systems Summit. Green box measures to protect the environment. As I mentioned to you at the UN Food Systems Summit, there was a lot of discussion of permissible green subsidies in the WTO that are actually very harmful for the environment because they are intensifying agriculture. And so there's a call from the environmental community for us to rethink how we are defining our green box subsidies. What is green? What is green today in light of climate concerns? But there's also a discussion that was taking place at the UN Food Systems Summit, which has no echo in the WTO, but is an important background issue because sooner or later it will have echo. And it's the issue of food miles. I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but it basically has to do with some consumer groups and some non-governmental organizations pushing the concept of 0-kilometer foods. It is better for me, Doa, if I want to eat an apple or an orange, to buy a local apple or orange wherever I find it, instead of buying an international apple or an international orange, because of the distance traveled by the food. The distance traveled by the food is harmful to the environment because there was a ship involved, there might have been an airplane involved, and there might have been a truck. And so the distance traveled by food for them is a really big issue. And there is a rise in this 0-kilometer slow food movement across the globe. And so the question is, you know, what do we in the WTO want to do about that? How do we want to address that? From a WTO perspective, I think what we've been saying, we the Secretariat, what some WTO members have been saying is, well, clearly what we need to do is to green the transportation, the means of transportation. We need aircrafts that travel on safer fuels, that travel probably less in a more efficient way. Cargo planes that, you know, just improving the logistics of cargo can do a lot to reduce sort of the damage done through transportation. But our answer has basically been to say, look at the means of transportation and look how we can improve the transportation rather than attacking the product that is being moved. Our position has also been to say, you know, what is the difference between an apple that moves and an iPhone that moves? Why is an apple okay, but an iPhone, you know, but an iPhone okay? I mean, miles are traveled by all internationally traded products, not just foods. But I think for the environmental community, I think it's also been an issue of, it's also been an issue of food freshness and nutrition. There's also been a food freshness and nutrition angle to the issue of food miles. With some non-governmental organizations saying that food purchased locally is more fresh and therefore more nutritious, in particular fruits and vegetables. Now, this issue is an issue, this issue of food miles is an issue that developing countries have been countering very seriously in the WTO. They've been saying, look, if this food miles issue gets out of control, we will be penalized. Our agricultural exports will be penalized. And there needs to be a life cycle assessment of the life of a particular food. If I'm Kenya, for example, and I'm able to grow food in natural sunlight using human labor and not tractors, and whereas you, the EU, for example, require greenhouse. And if I'm hearing some background noise, I think could you all put yourselves on mute? Okay, so whereas you, the EU, might be using greenhouses to produce your food, energy-intensive greenhouses, you may have more mechanized agriculture, so your agricultural production process is itself more harmful to the environment, so you can't just look at the travel of a product, you must also look at how it's produced. And so, you know, a lot of arguments for and against food miles, but that's part of how the environment and the issues raised in the UN Food Systems Summit interact with what's happening in WTO. Then there's the issue of farmers' rights, a big issue at the UN Food Systems Summit. In fact, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, is going to deliver his report very soon in Geneva to the UN Human Rights Council. And his report this year is focused on seeds, the right to life, and farmers' rights. And basically his report argues that the intellectual property protection of seeds is very harmful to farmers. And where does that intellectual property protection express itself? Well, it expresses itself under the WTO agreement on the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, the TRIPS agreement, which allows innovators to protect their inventions for a certain number of years, which allows for royalties and so on. And so he is arguing that our TRIPS agreement is basically harmful to farmers. The issue of farmers' rights discussed in the UN Food System Summit, and which got its expression in seeds in this rapporteur's report, is also a development box subsidies issue, because the developing world wants to help its farmers through subsidies. And developing countries are saying, look, developing world subsidies are now out of control, and we really need to start putting a ceiling on them. So that's another issue. Sorry. So the question is, what is the way forward then? So, you know, you've now heard what was discussed at the UN Food System Summit. There were no conclusions at the summit per se on the issues raised at the summit: environment, labor, nutrition. There were dialogues. The summit was run as a series of dialogues. It wasn't designed to come up with, you know, with specific solutions or an international agreement of some sort. It was designed to come up with dialogues and with actions that countries could take to improve the situation on all of those different tracks that they had identified. But those issues seriously intersect with what we're doing, as you just saw in this presentation, and are so complex that they are paralyzing our negotiations. And so the question is, you know, what do we do now in the WTO? We haven't made progress in liberalizing agricultural trade for a long time. And frankly, the Committee on Agriculture in special session, the negotiating group, has been going through the same agenda over and over again: tariffs, subsidies, export competition, export restriction, you know, just the same agenda, trying to make progress on it without any change. And the question is, do we need to move away from established agendas? Do we in some way need to address pressing 22nd century concerns? Should we negotiate in different configurations? Is the way we're negotiating still the right way? I don't know if in the course of this program you will have heard of joint statement initiatives in the WTO, but it's a new approach to trade liberalization where countries are negotiating in small groups of like-minded countries with the hope of, you know, once they're able to achieve progress amongst the like-minded, they can then expand it to other countries. So, you know, do we need to continue to consider different approaches, perhaps even in agriculture, of joint statements like that? Do we need to bring different actors around the negotiating table? Is it enough to have government? Do we need other actors? Are there any other options? But you will also see that in point number 1 here, I said, we really need to also put this in the context of changing trends in world trade. And what do I mean by that? When the WTO Agreement on Agriculture was born, it was the developed world selling food to the developing world. Today the world has changed. It is the South that is selling food that is mostly selling food to the North, and there's a lot of South-South trade. You know, so we also need to be looking at changing trends in world trade as we reconsider the overall architecture of agricultural discussions and negotiations in the WTO. I'll stop here, and what I would like now to do is to sort of move into a Q&A. I'll stop sharing so that I see more of you. I'll stop sharing my screen so that I see more of you, and that way I could also see the chat, hopefully. Let me see, in just a second. I'd also like to see the chat in case you prefer to put your question in the chat. Yes, so now I see all of you, and we also have the chat, and I'd like to sort of pause for a bit and just have a discussion with you. What are your reactions to what you've just heard, and do you think we need to sort of reconfigure the agriculture negotiations in the WTO? Do we need to take a different approach given the current stalemate and our inability to produce results? I can't see all of you on my screen at the same time, so don't rely on raising your hand. Okay, more examples of Amber, but okay, good. So do put your questions into the chat, or just indicate in the chat that you want to speak, or just take the microphone and speak. Let's make this very informal. So could you provide more examples of Amber box subsidies? Amber box subsidies, as I said, are the most trade distorting. So it's when you are linking your subsidy. So it's when you are linking your subsidy to a particular type and quantity of production. So you're actually dictating on your farmer what that farmer must do, what they must produce and how much. That kind, and subsidizing them to do so. That kind of subsidy is considered the worst kind of subsidy in the WTO. There's a very complex approach in the WTO agreement to measuring those subsidies. And that measurement approach is itself considered quite controversial, because it has, it has particular benchmarks and base periods with which some are questioning. Some are saying even the methodology needs updating of how you calculate those subsidies to make that calculation more relevant to today. That agreement was decided back in 1996. Today we are in 2022. We really need to modernize our approach to measuring those subsidies. So that's Amber box subsidies. There's another question on subsidies that I'll just take before coming to MRLs. You can all see the questions in the chat and feel free to put in more questions. Could you please provide more information on blue box subsidies? So blue box subsidies, as I said, are the subsidies that are designed to, that were designed back in 1996 to help countries transition from highly distorted systems of agriculture to more market-oriented agricultural systems, using subsidies as a tool to achieve that reform. So blue box subsidies are production limiting subsidies. So it's a subsidy that you give to a farmer not to produce. It could be an early pension for a farmer. If you say, if you stay at home and don't produce at all, I'll give you an early pension. Move out of agriculture because we have been overproducing, and we need to correct, that overproduction that we've had of a particular commodity. It's a very it sounds very counterintuitive, but I think it's part of transitioning to reform without creating social damage. You're still looking after the interests of your farmer, even as you're asking him to reduce production. And this, by the way, has a counterpart in today's world and today's discussions. So in the UN Food Systems Summit, as countries were complaining about, as NGOs and countries and all the players that were at the summit were complaining about environmentally harmful subsidies in agriculture, a movement was born that is called the Just Transition in Agriculture, which is designed to allow countries to move away from environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies whilst looking after their farmers and addressing the just needs of farmers. Because you can't just overnight tell, for example, a livestock farmer that he can no longer grow livestock. You need a just rural transition. So there's now a whole movement called Just Rural Transition because of this environmental problem, which is not unlike our blue box. It's the same concept coming back again, but there it was to reduce trade distortion, and now it's to reduce environmental harm. Now, there's a question about MRLs imposed. What about the maximum MRL? So as I said, we have two agreements in the WTO that are designed to address regulatory issues to do with agriculture. And perhaps, I'm not sure, but perhaps they were also or will be on your program at some point. The agreement on technical barriers to trade and the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. The agreement on technical barriers to trade is an agreement that says, that's designed to address things like packaging and labeling requirements for food, It's an agreement that has as its objective ensuring that regulations, that whilst countries have all the space they need to regulate for the legitimate objectives that they have, such as environmental protection, eliminating misleading consumer information, and so on, those regulations are fine, but they have to be non-discriminatory, they have to be transparent, and so on. So it sets out a number of sort of principles that countries must respect as they regulate. The agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures goes to food safety regulations. So it's the one that would address this MRL issue that's been raised. MRLs are maximum residue limits, for those of you who are not familiar with that term. And countries in general, have rules on MRLs for pesticides, agrochemicals that stay in the foods. They set maximums so that, we're not intoxicated as we eat. And the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures basically says that countries have the right, of course, to create MRLs for foods, but they must do a number of different things. They must ensure that their regulations are science-based, that they have conducted a risk assessment. They must try as much as possible to base their regulations on international standards. And in the case of MRLs, this is very important because we have, for example, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is a regulatory body, international regulatory body for food standards. And Codex gives a lot of guidance on MRLs. Countries can exceed them, if they want, but the WTO recommends that they apply international standards so that exporters don't find themselves faced with hundreds of different standards. If they exceed them, they must have a risk assessment to demonstrate why there's a risk for exceeding that standard. So the MRLs of the EU, would be, if they are in contravention of international standards, would have to be justified through risk assessments, and the right forum for addressing them would be the SPS agreement. Let me just go through some of the other questions. Hold on. WTO a question from Tisha Pia de la Rosa. What a beautiful name, let me just say. WTO negotiations on agriculture are almost at a standstill, given the unresolved issues in public stock holding, domestic support, and the special safeguard mechanism. Will there be a chance for the negotiations to move forward? No. If those issues are not resolved, there is no chance that these issues will move forward. That's of course, oh, sorry, I'm enlarging my screen and now I see more of you. My apologies, I'm not the most talented with technology. Okay, so no, they won't. The public stock holding issue has become a big symbol of the food security issue. If you ask me, it's an important issue, but it's not the key food security issue. It's a very important issue for the countries that are arguing that issue, but I think that the food security agenda of the WTO needs to go beyond that, and the issue of food export restrictions is key. But no, there will be no progress, in my opinion, if we don't succeed in finding compromises on all of those issues. Domestic support is another huge issue, because historically US subsidies have been very high. In many countries, in particular the food exporting coalition in the WTO, often referred to as the Cairns Group, which includes large agricultural exporters like Australia, New Zealand, a lot of Latin American countries, Argentina, Brazil, of course, just a big coalition of agricultural exporters. They want to see the domestic subsidies that other players provide, they want to see them come under control. And historically, US subsidies have been very high and need to be reduced. And the developing world is saying, well, until the developed world gives the right example, on what basis are they asking us to address our subsidies now in particular, since our subsidies, even if they're growing, they're relatively new compared to that sort of historical inequity. A question from Fabien Saez. There has been discussion in small groups, friends of the chair schemes, text-based discussions. I'm not sure what a different configuration can be. I wonder whether it is a configuration or lack of political will. I think it's both. Clearly, there's a lack of political will, but can different configurations break that problem of political will? So, as I said, I don't know if you've had presentations on the joint statement initiatives, but basically on a number of issues, developing such as e-commerce, such as investment facilitation, such as domestic regulation in the area of services trade. Countries, small groups of countries have come together to create joint initiatives to see whether they could start to make progress on an issue. Of course, this hasn't been without political resistance in the WTO. Some countries have said, you're breaking the multilateral forum. WTO is multilateral. It has 164 members. All committees normally work with the entire membership. In joint statement initiatives, it's a small group of countries that are moving forward with an issue. And the sort of elephant in the room in these discussions is the issue of the most favored nation clause, which is, if I, Doha, give a trade concession to a small group of countries in the joint statement initiative, will I then give that concession to the rest of the WTO membership, most favored nation clause, or will I just give that concession to the small group that's within the joint statement initiative? And there's a big sort of legal discussion taking place at the moment as to what is allowed. Can these joint statements just make a different, can they apply the privileges and the liberalization just to themselves, or do they have to automatically expand them to everybody else, given that this is happening under the WTO umbrella? And so, there's a big battle there, but I think that those are my personal opinions, but I think that there's a room for negotiating agriculture in different ways. Instead of putting all, that menu into the same negotiating group, subsidies, tariffs, export restrictions, export competition, one committee, 164 members, all of those 4 issues, maybe there's a way to just slice them into smaller issues and smaller groups of countries and start to make progress in different ways. So it's just a thought. I think we need to start brainstorming along those lines. We also, as I said, need to think of whether we need different actors around the table. Yes, the WTO is intergovernmental, but do we need to start injecting energy into the system by bringing other types of players in different ways into the system? Non-governmental organizations, experts, food safety, food whatever experts, environmental agricultural experts into the negotiating room? Is there space for that? Can we be more creative? Then a question from Alejandro. There was recently a case in the WTO dispute settlement system, India sugar. Interesting was among claimants, Brazil, a developing country. The panel concluded that India violated the agreement on agriculture because it was subsidizing sugar exports. I think this shows that there is not the same position amongst developing countries in these issues. Could you please develop this statement? Well, yes, you're right. There was this dispute, and India violated this was actually quite a fairly clear-cut case because India violated its commitments on export subsidies for sugar. So there was, it wasn't a controversial case. Again, I think this sort of reflects, I think that the successful dispute settlement that we still have on in agricultural disputes shows that the WTO is working. We may not be making progress in the negotiations, but dispute settlement is continuing to successfully apply the WTO rulebook and to successfully apply the tariff and subsidy schedules of our members. In this case, this was quite a straightforward application of India's commitments in the WTO. We looked at those commitments. We looked at what it was really what India was really doing, and it was outside of those commitments. And you know, it wasn't this wasn't a complicated sort of value judgment-based dispute where there was a cultural issue to do with technology, where there was a food security sort of concern. This was an export subsidy dispute and not a domestic food security issue. So I thought that was a fairly straightforward case and shows that luckily one wing of the WTO system, which is dispute settlement, is still able to deliver. Olivera, if I'm not mistaken, the EU carbon adjustment mechanism is dealing with industrial products. Who is opposing, challenging those measures in the WTO in the agricultural context? Yes, the first proposal of the EU that's currently being discussed is focused on industrial products. The concern is that this will sooner or later come to bite agricultural products as well. Agricultural products are always late in the game because agriculture is more sensitive than industrial products for all the reasons that I gave at the outset of this presentation. In no kind of international negotiation, regional negotiation, etc., do people put agriculture up front. Agriculture comes later. In trade policy, we went further on industrial products than we did on agricultural products. Then we created the agreement on agriculture, and we're still relatively behind industrial products on tariffs. There are very high tariff peaks on agricultural products. There are very high subsidies on agricultural products. We're still behind. And it's the same for climate policy. For example, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change doesn't talk about agriculture specifically. You find agriculture in the national pledges that countries have submitted to achieve the 1.5 degree maximum temperature rise. But the UNFCCC itself and the Paris Climate Agreement doesn't talk about agriculture specifically. The fear of WTO members is that this will come to agriculture. But the other thing that's important to bear in mind is that fertilizer is an industrial product in the WTO, and fertilizer, of course, is necessary for agriculture. And so a lot of agricultural producing, fertilizer producing countries like Russia, most notably, and Ukraine, are very concerned about the carbon tax because it will apply to fertilizer. Who is opposing those measures? Russia, Ukraine, all the fertilizer exporters, but a lot of countries that are also worried about their industrial goods. So the US is not particularly in favor of the EU's carbon tax either, and would prefer to find another kind of solution to the carbon issue, a multilateral solution and not an EU initiative. Another question, very interesting. Do you think agriculture negotiations under the WTO can contribute to recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic? All trade and all economic growth generated through trade can contribute to recovery through the COVID-19 pandemic. I am really glad that the agricultural sector has been more resilient during the pandemic than other sectors, because people have tried to continue to have food move from different parts of the globe to one another, because it's very important that we share our food. It's what we teach our children to share. We need to teach countries to share, and we need to teach them to share what is most vital to share at a time of crisis, which is food. And so I'm really glad that agriculture resisted the pandemic. As I said, in fact, agricultural trade even grew. Towards the end of the pandemic, it even rose. So, it declined by a bit and then immediately achieved pre-pandemic levels and then rose. So it's a big success story for that sector. And yes, of course, it will help with the recovery. Of course, we now have a war with very broad implications for agriculture, in particular with Ukraine being so vital to global food security because of all of its wheat and grain production. So, and as I said, we're now seeing a new wave of food export restrictions. So we'll have to see how all of that plays out, and hopefully it won't undo sort of the resilience that we've seen in the sector during COVID-19. Are there any other questions? We still have 5 minutes. If not, then Alicia, I'll hand over to you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Doha, for this informative overview and showing us the linkages between the rules in the WTO under the Agreement on Agriculture and the broader policy concerns, whether they are producers, consumers, traders, farmers, and especially broader issues like climate change or nutrition, and linking them together in a very informative presentation. So I appreciate very much. I just wanted to mention that I believe you are organizing, and in the context of those broader discussions, you are organizing some sessions called dialogues. And if they are available and advertised on the WTO website, does it mean that anyone who gets the notice about it would be able to connect? Because should there be our participants who would like to revisit these issues with a specific focus in future weeks and months, and if you are organizing these dialogues, if you would just mention a little bit how this works and where one can find information about it.
Absolutely. Yes, so I have I've just pasted into the chat the link to the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food. Those are regular discussions that we in the WTO organize with the outside world, but we also include government, of course, NGOs, agribusiness, farmers, other UN and international organizations, regular dialogues that we organize monthly on exactly the sorts of issues that we've been tackling in this presentation. We've had about 16 episodes so far. And in those episodes, we've discussed environment, nutrition. The issue of food miles has had an entire episode because of how important it is. We just had a really big conference last week on illegal trade in food and food fraud, which drew a lot of viewers because apparently it's a very big concern, and a lot of governments still don't have the infrastructure to deal with food fraud, which is very complicated. And so I would really recommend that you watch those dialogues at that website. They're live on YouTube, and all the recordings of previous episodes are on this page. So this is all YouTube. You just have to click on the episode that you want to watch, and and it will play. You can go to that same site to see what the upcoming episode is. As I said, it's monthly, so if you check this website regularly, you'll always be up to date on on what's coming next. And I think they've really helped us in the WTO understand what some of the concerns are, and they've helped negotiators also see sort of broader horizons of what people are thinking. And so let's hope that we find a way of merging all of these different issues that we discussed today, because I think cutting up the food system into silos is what is preventing progress, because in the end, when a country decides what to do with its agricultural system, it's looking at all of these issues together that we've discussed today. It's not doing that kind of breakup, artificial breakup of issues that we have in WTO, that was done in the UNFSS. A country looks at all of its interests holistically. And so we at the international level have to try to do that as well, so we can deliver.
Great. Thank you very much, Doha, for the presentation and for taking the questions. I think we've arrived at our allotted time, just in time. So I would like to mention that we will be taking a 15-minute break. and we will come back at 11:30 for our session on G20 Agricultural Market Information System. And at the end of that session, I will also give you some announcements regarding week 5. It will be a very interesting week. Again, number of elements, components to this week. So I think it would be good if we, if I sort of map out what we're going to be doing next week as well. So let's have a 15-minute break. And for those who have nothing to do, in case you have not submitted for us the feedback on Module 3, which was the week on trade and services, you could perhaps take a few moments and fill out that evaluation form for week 3 and send it to us as soon as possible. So I thank you for now, and I see you back in 15 minutes at 11:30. We will start sharp. Thank you.